name's David Gregory. I'm a Vice Chair of SEAANZ, but I'm also the CEO of the Small Business Mentoring Service, the Small Business Institute and Scale Up Australia. The Small Business Mentoring Service has over 200 mentors, and we're the largest provider of small business mentoring support in Australia. We've been around for around 35 years, and we deliver more than 5,000 mentoring sessions each year to businesses across Australia. Since 2010, the mentoring we've provided has actually resulted in businesses contributing more than $20 billion to the economy. Suffice to say, that says that we've got some experience within the space. Our mentors too are those that have actually worked in real businesses. They have walked the walk, they've fallen in holes and learned how to pull themselves out of it, and they impart that knowledge back to small businesses. We have supported businesses in the good times and the bad. We have also supported startups right through to those that are exiting businesses, and from those that have gone from little businesses and want to stay that way to those that have moved on to bigger and better things. We've also looked after businesses that have been impacted by bushfires, floods, droughts, and now a pandemic. So the impact of COVID on small business cannot be understated. From the cities to the regions, the small business landscape has changed, and both the businesses themselves as well as the supports provided needs to change with it. Coming back after COVID-19 and living and operating within the limitations it imposes will not be easy, but neither was starting and developing a business in the first place, as Anna and Nerida can attest to. It's a tough working space. In the years to come, many will look back on those that saw what others couldn't see during the pandemic as our inspiration, as our leaders, and as the reason that our economy returns. So that brings us to our next speaker and my dear friend, Mark. Mark has a whole lot of inaugurals aligned to his CV, from the first ever Small Business Commissioner to the Liquor Licensing and Gambling Commissioner to the Federal Small Business Commissioner. Mark stands as a true champion for the sector. There is also no doubt that tomorrow's entrepreneurs like Anna and Nerida, our previous presenters, need support, and that they may hold the key to restarting and reinvigorating our economy. Mark recently wrote a paper proposing a new way that this could happen. So I'll hand over to Mark, and Mark, could you tell us all about it?
Thank you, David. I'm impressed by the introduction, and you're CEO of the Small Business Mentoring Service. You might recall I'm the chairman. I thought you looked familiar. I've been looking at the facial.
Vaguely.
I sort of, the penny dropped that that's my CEO's sitting there. Look, I'm pleased to be able to present here. Our topic's really about coming out of the pandemic and what it might be for the small business sector. And I recently did a thought piece for SEAANZ entitled Beyond JobKeeper, for small business, where is it all going to go, and what we have learned about all of that. And essentially, that paper is really about government intervention in the business sector. And I thought at first that I'd just share my views on when government ought to intervene in the small business sector. I've long expressed the view that there are two sort of core responsibilities which government has when it's going to regulate or in any way do an intervention into the business sector. And these are very much lasting responsibilities. The first one I term in the general sense education, and the second one I term in the general sense justice. Now, in between both of those, lots of other interventions might occur, which are really responses to issues of current controversy. But essentially, if government's going to be spending taxpayers' money in getting into the business sector, I think they've got to tick one or both of those boxes of whether it's an education initiative or a justice initiative. And by education, I use the term very broadly, not just the construction of academic courses, but the provision of information and a lot of government money does go on websites which are informative, and that's a good expenditure. Also, in terms of education, I'd put under that something very close to me, of course, is mentoring as an educative mechanism, and other forms of advice and assistance. So if government's spending money on any of those sorts of activities, I think it's a worthwhile and it's a good expenditure of taxpayers' funds. That's all designed to get things right and to get people operating in an effective way within the business environment. There also needs to be a safeguard if things don't go quite right, and that's why I think there's a justification to have government intervention to ensure that the justice system is all right. And we often think about justice in terms of putting naughty people behind bars for doing naughty things. But in fact, it's much broader than that, and it's about making sure everyone has a fair go. And in the business context, the very popular thing of recent times has been the provision of mechanisms for alternative dispute resolution. And these, of course, were flagship functions of the small business commissioners, and even this morning, Bruce Bilson mentioned about the dispute support portal, which the Ombudsman has to help people find the most effective way of getting a matter resolved without having to go through all the expenses of going to court, which is very costly, very time-consuming, very emotionally stressful, and the only winners are really the lawyers out of all of that. So I see those pillars as being the key things for government to look at if they're going to be intervening. Does the proposed intervention tick a box of education, or does it tick a box of justice, or does it do both? Now, as I say, in between times there'll be issues that will arise where it's appropriate to intervene because of being responsive to particular areas of current controversy. COVID, most notable one recently, but also things like bushfires and floods, and you'll see activities done there. However, a learning which I think we can take out of the COVID experience is that perhaps we should be looking at these government interventions being more of an enduring nature, so that they can cope with these things that arise unexpectedly. The JobKeeper response to COVID, I think, was an excellent one in the circumstances. But if we had had in place an existing scheme that people might have been able to access, you wouldn't have had to go through all of the extra expenditure of establishing a new response, namely JobKeeper. And that's why the major point of my paper, which I've done for SEAANZ, is for government to consider more enduring programs as distinct from what might be seen as Band-Aid type programs, or even more critically, what I identify as being politically opportunistic programs which come up 3 months before an election and then disappear into the ether not long afterwards. There have not been many examples of that happen at all. So what I've proposed is that we encourage government to try to look at establishing schemes that are in place that people are familiar with. They know how to go to them if the occasion arises that they need to, and it's therefore less of a strain on the administrative system to be able to help people survive particular crises. And the example I've given is to mirror what has happened in the education sector with I call it the HEX scheme, but I think it's called HELP these days, but I refer to it as a HEX scheme. And the policy justification, it seems to me, for establishing a HEX scheme was that you'd get rid of whatever other educative expenditure was going on at the time, and you just pour it basically all into a commitment to HEX. And the justification is that, I assume anyway, is that we'll have great benefit in having a better educated society. And it's therefore worthwhile spending whatever we've been spending on all sorts of other, sometimes I call them harebrained schemes, rather than looking at something much more constructive, much more available. And I think something which has been very successful. The naysayers will say, no, it's far too expensive. And I know I've run this past the Commonwealth Treasury a few years back when I was Australian Small Business Commissioner. And that was their immediate leap, was to say, oh, it's too expensive to have that sort of thing for small business. But the reality is that in the education sector, sure, it's been expensive, and sure, they don't get all of the recovery as to the way that system works, because I think most of you know that the way the HEC system works is that there is a return to government through the tax system once people start earning money, and it's a softer way of getting the money back. I think most ex-students would sort of say they hardly notice that they're repaying their loan. It just sort of comes through their what they've become accustomed to as their tax liability. And I think a similar thing could happen for small business. We know we've got the infrastructure to be able to do it through the taxation system. That's been demonstrated through the HEC system. We know, and I'm being a little bit courageous in saying this, we know it's a successful measure, and I say that without any of the evidence-based proof for it. It's probably what I prefer, more intuitive, but I say it on the basis that we've continued to do it, that the HEC system hasn't been dropped, it's been continued. And that reinforces in my mind the view that this is the type of approach which we could implement also for the small business sector. And in fact, I finish off in my paper by sort of saying, we trust our 18-year-old students. Why can't we trust our small businesses? And I think it would be well received by the small, well, I know it's well received by the small business sector, because when I floated it previously, there's great enthusiasm for it, because it means getting their hands on some finance without too much hassle about doing it, which is really the most challenging thing. And it's the sort of thing which most small businesses would say, if I had more money, my business would be more successful. Well, let's give them the access to more money. And if it's not successful, well, they'll go and do something else and they'll pay some of it back, and hopefully even pay it all back. But at least it'll come back. Whereas your other interventions like JobKeeper and that, it's a terrific outlay. But unless there's appeals to conscience, which there has been, I think, none of that the JobKeeper payments that went out really in a significant way come back to government at all. It is taxable, of course, and there is something there, but not in the sense of the way in which the HECS system works, which is a recovery of the loan. So I've put that out there as an illustrative way in which governments could put in place a more enduring mechanism. And if that had been in place when COVID hit, for example, well, businesses that may not have taken up the HECS system previously could have easily gone about doing that and got them the type of assistance which they would have required to respond to the challenges that were put up by COVID. And even going forward, it seems to me is that government programs where the government decides what grant or what assistance it might give you, and they specify what they're giving it to you for, has got something wrong with it, because it's the government telling you how to run your business. And in my experience, most people in government have never run a business or even been involved in a business. And David will be, Julie, I think you're familiar with this comment that I make, that they're very much like umpires who've never played the game, that they don't know what it's like to be out in the small business sector. and how difficult it is to operate. So they don't see any problem in sort of saying, okay, well, we will give it an assistance scheme, but you've got to do this with it. And one size doesn't fit all. But if you were able to just give access to finance and let the business sink or swim according to their own judgments, I think that's fine. Now, having said that, I'd still make it obviously, if we're going to bring in a HEX system for small business, some sort of qualifying criteria, pretty much the same as the way the HEX system works for education. I'm quite certain you've actually got to have an enrolment or a place at an academic institution before you can get the access to HEX. Well, I think some criteria could be developed for to have some confidence that the business seeking the HEX-like assistance has got the wherewithal to be able to at least embark upon what they want to do, or have already demonstrated that they know what they're doing and it's a legitimate and so it's not a ghost-like business at all. So they're the encouragements which we're looking to get. TUI's written to the Federal Treasurer and State Small Business Ministers, given them a copy of the paper, seeking some consideration about it. We've also gone to some industry associations, and just generally I've sort of put it out to a lot of other people in the business sector that I know. And I think the TUI can probably knows more about the response than what I do, but it appears as though there's some interest in it, and it's probably got more legs and credibility at this time. And I've made the point about that. It's a timing issue than say when I floated something similar some time back. At the time when I was sort of floating it, there wasn't the COVID challenges, and I think the timing's right to be seeking some sort of consideration of these things. Now, I'd be happy enough for a proper feasibility be done of a suggestion like this and be told, well, it doesn't work or we're not prepared to go with it, than to have just a dismissive, oh no, it's going to be too expensive. Because I think if you look at the expenses that happen in other areas and rationalise those, you go a long way towards funding this in any event. Sorry, that's a long answer to your first question, David.
Thanks, Mark. No, it is a great idea, and I think it's an opportunity to support not only small businesses in general, but particularly as we're coming out of COVID, our entrepreneurial community, those that are seeking to start out, or those that have got a great idea, and the country can benefit from those ideas. The challenge within that space, well, there's a couple. The first is, why should government intervene? And if government were to intervene and introduce such a HEX scheme, how would you qualify those that were going to be involved in the scheme to make sure that they had the wherewithal to deliver on what they hoped to in developing their business?
Yeah, well, the reason why government should intervene is really relates back to my preliminary comments about what I sort of saw as the core responsibilities of government, to ensure that there's education and information available for small businesses to be able to operate. And as Small Business Commissioner in Victoria, I had a maxim that no small business should fail through lack of access to information. And I think that still rings true, that there should be this investment in getting the best informed business community so that they can make the right decisions about their business. And if you can improve at decision making, we're going to improve the quality of the business environment as a whole. So I think that's a key reason as to why we might have something like the HEX scheme. The HEX scheme doesn't contemplate a dispute resolution thing. Like I said, the other major thing was a justice thing, but it certainly ticks the box of the on the information side. So far as the criteria, I haven't looked at exploring that in the paper as to what the particular criteria would be. I sort of see that as another exercise altogether. But as I said just before, from a general point of view, I think we'd have to set up something that would sort of show that you just not have decided. I think it's a good idea to apply for a small business HECS assistance. I think there'll be things to be able to demonstrate. And one of them may be, again, David, close to us, might be that you've already gone through some mentoring sessions, for example. That could be one of the criteria. Or that you've done some sort of preliminary course, or you've done a very substantial course. Or there might be other demonstration of, in a sense, on-the-job training. You might have actually run the business, but you've worked in a particular business that you're going to now take forward. So there could be quite a myriad of, quite a range of things which could be looked at as setting up the criteria. And as I say, I think it's a separate exercise of its own, and quite an interesting one as to how you'd look at the qualifiers. Having said that, I hope that the qualification range is very broad, because I prefer people to be getting in and having a go and having the opportunity of having a go than not being given the opportunity to get in at all. And so I think it's got that value.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Mark. In fact, you're preaching to the choir here. I personally would think that the opportunity for a business that hopes to open or is exploring new opportunities, they can't possibly know everything, and to surround themselves with experts. Obviously, I'm wheeling out the mentoring barrow, but the suggestion that a business can get accreditation or certification through having a number of sessions with people that have the qualifications to recognise what is needed to open a business could be critical.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I mean, accreditation systems, I've always been very much in favour of them. I've actually encouraged them amongst industry associations that they do those sorts of things for their members, but with a caution that they can't be dime a dozen, that any accreditation scheme has got to have integrity and rigour about it, rather than, I think a few years back, I remember that every travel agent in captivity had accredited travel agent after their name. I think we can be a bit more rigorous in the way in which we go about those. But accreditation could be one of the means of having a qualification thing for the access to the system, to a system like that.
I think that's a fantastic suggestion, and I think that most in this room would certainly be supportive of it. I'm very conscious of the time that we have, and I can see Muriel in the background sitting nervously as the clock ticks down. So perhaps, Mark, if you'd be open to any questions that might be around the room.
I'll just make another couple of comments then. Just one, finishing off on the accreditation thing. You can get some people in some areas who might be reluctant to give accreditations unless they've got some sort of immunity attached to it, some protection. But anyway, that's a side issue. The other thing I just want to say is that in response to anyone who, say like Treasury and the likes, who might sort of say, well, how do we fund these sorts of schemes? If we're going to have a HECS scheme for small business, for example. What I'm saying there is that we rationalise what programs we've already got, and we really look at whether right round, and this is cooperatively amongst all of the jurisdictions, actually, it's the states as well as the Commonwealth here, that we look at what sort of programs we've got. Are they fly by night? Are they political opportunistic ones? And take the funding from those to put in to help fund the HECS scheme. This sort of thing, there has been a little bit of a precedence for this, and it's pity Bruce isn't still with us, because when he was the minister, the federal minister in 2014-15, the budget, 2014-15 budget, was regarded as the small business package budget. And one of the things that happened there was that they established what was called the Entrepreneurs Infrastructure Program. It's now called the Entrepreneurs Program. And they found $484.4 million for that out of nowhere. But where they got most of it from was they just got rid of all of the other programs they had. Commercialisation Australia, lots of other programs that were in existence. They just stopped them and they used the funding that they're putting into those, into this. So it's that sort of approach which I think is worth looking at. And incidentally, that entrepreneurs program is still going. So it is one of the ones that's got some endurance about it. And that's the encouragement I'm trying to give to government, is to identify things which are enduring so you can keep accessing if you go. Sure, you can improve them if you go too, but rather than doing these piecemeal band-aids along the way. And you can find the money by rationalising what you've already got out there. And if anyone's got any doubts about where they can find the money, well, where did they find it for JobKeeper?